Welcome to our study of an overview of the book of Revelation. This class was taught for the British Bible School in a Zoom class on the 12th and the 14th of August 2020 as the UK continues to return to some degree of normality. Before we get into the text we're going to look at in this lesson, let's do just a brief review of where we are in the book. In our last lesson, we saw the sounding of the first 6 trumpets. These were indicating that there were disasters coming, but God's people were protected. The first woe was the 5th trumpet, and there are 3 woes. The first was the 5th trumpet, and this talked about the locust scorpions that would hurt people for 5 months. We commented in our last lesson that possibly these is the Romans under Cestius who harassed the Jews for months before Vespasian's army arrived. The second woe was in the 6th trumpet during the lull, and 1/10 of Jerusalem fell with 7,000 killed in an earthquake. And the third woe was soon to come, and that is the destruction of the city. We also learned about the dragon persecuting God's people in chapter 12. And we're going to pick up with that image as we go into chapter 13. We're going to see the dragon empowering beasts. And then in chapter 14, we're going to turn our attention to God's people, who are represented once again by 144,000. This is the outline that we're using for our study of Revelation, and this is where we are, chapters 13 and 14 in this lesson. Now keep in mind that John is seeing a vision. It's images, it's signs, it's symbols. These mean something, and we're going to try to determine, once we see what it is that he's seeing, a possible explanation for what this vision is talking about. Jim McGuigan wrote about this section as we go into chapter 13. He said, chapter 13 is the site of much contention over the years. And part of the reason for this is it's a difficult chapter. Dogmatism is never a pleasant thing, but it's especially out of place here. Still, despite the difficulties connected with it, it is explainable. Keep your Bible and your mind open, and let's go at it. So, let's go at it ourselves. Chapter 13 opens. John saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, and on the horns are 10 crowns. The Greek word this time is diadem, the ruler's crown. And on the heads were blasphemous names. Now, the idea of having 7 heads, 7 completeness, and heads indicate power, so this seems to be indicating complete or totality of power. Horns, by the way, also represent power, but that's going to be explained for us what these horns represent in chapter 17. So we're not going to go into that at this time. The idea of blasphemy. The Greek word means slander or speech that's injurious to another's good name. And this is what this beast was doing. Now, the beast, as you can see in the description there in the text, has the characteristics of many animals. It was like a leopard, its feet like a bear, its mouth like a lion. But it's the dragon who gave the beast its power. Also, besides giving it power, gave it a throne and great authority. So this should tell us that this beast represents something or someone that's in power, and that it's got crowns. It's involved in some way with government. In fact, it's got a throne as well. It's a government. But John then saw that one of the 7 heads looked as if it had been killed, but the fatal wound was healed. In other words, it would appear that the head had been killed, but it's back to life. And the whole world was amazed by the beast and followed it. In fact, They even worshiped the dragon because it had empowered the beast. And they worshiped the beast as well. There is nothing like the beast, they said. The beast was then given a mouth, and he spoke arrogant words and blasphemies. Now we realize that, as Gene West put it, wars are waged not only with weapons, but with words. And this beast was going to wage a war with words against God and his people. And so we see that going on here as well. This beast had authority to act for 12 months. Not 12 months, 42 months. Again, that number 42 months should tell us something. It should tell us that we're seeing something about the destruction of Jerusalem again. The beast opened his mouth and began to utter blasphemies against God, against God's name, against his tabernacle or his dwelling place, and those who live in heaven. And the beast was allowed to make war with the saints and to overcome them. He had authority over everyone in every nation. All who lived on the earth would worship him, that is, all who did not have their name in the book of life. And that's referring to Christians. Christians would not worship the beast. Then we have those who have an ear need to listen to what is being said. In other words, this is important. Verse 10 is a statement to encourage the Christians, to encourage them to keep on living for Jesus, to endure and persevere despite what might happen to them, whether it be captivity or death. And that phrase there is from Jeremiah chapter 15 and verse 2. This is also very similar to what we find that Jesus said when he was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in Matthew 24. In verse 9, we find this: "Then they will deliver you into distress and kill you. You will be hated by all nations because of my name, and many will be caused to stumble, and they will betray one another and will hate one another." Very similar conditions to what John here is recording in Revelation. So the question for us should be, who does the beast represent? Well, let's reason through this just a little bit. Who was it that had power over Jerusalem for 42 months? We know historically that's Rome. Who was it that was worshipped as a deity? Well, Rome was. Both Rome itself and its Caesars. We'll see that in just a minute. And really from the first on, there were temples built to Julius Caesar and from there. Who was it that had influence over the whole world? By the way, the phrase "the whole world" in the first century referred to the Roman Empire. Obviously, it's Rome. Who persecuted Christians besides the Jews? It was Rome. And in the reference in Daniel, the lion was Babylon, the bear was Medo-Persia, the leopard was Greece, and the beast was the next kingdom. What was the next kingdom after Greece? It was Rome. And by the way, the Roman emperors assumed all sorts of blasphemous titles. At least they were blasphemous to God. Robertson, in his word pictures, wrote this: "The meaning is made plain by the blasphemous titles assumed by the Roman emperors in the 1st and 2nd centuries, as shown by the inscriptions in Ephesus, which have the Greek word theos constantly applied to them." Theos, by the way, translated, means God. They assumed the title of God. Gene West pointed out that Nero Caesar commanded absolute obedience in all things, and even had a statue of himself, 120 feet high, erected to represent him as a god. Now, this wound on the beast, on one of the heads, that appeared to be deadly, suggestion I've read, and I think it's a good suggestion, is that this refers to Julius Caesar and is talking about his assassination. Gene West commented on this. He said, it looked as if the death of Caesar brought an end, as Julius Caesar brought an end to the imperial troubles, and Rome would remain forever a republic, which she did for about 13 years. Notwithstanding, Octavian Caesar, who later named himself Augustus, had himself proclaimed emperor, and imperial Rome, thought to be dead, recovered and remained an empire until the western half fell to the marauding hordes of northern barbarians in the 5th century AD. Notice one of the heads bore the marks of a mortal wound, but the others were sound and healthy. This was John's way of speaking of the republic that became an empire, returned to being a republic for a very brief time, and then became an empire again. I think Gene has the right idea there. Those who marvel at the beast are those who dwell in the land. They're talking here about the land of Israel. The Israelites, the Jews, marveled at the beast. And again, Gene West in his commentary pointed this out. He says the word world here is not used as we use it today, meaning our universe, planet, or the people of the planet, nor is it so used in the other 11 places it is found in Revelation. The Jews were under the domination of the Roman Empire, which was not as altogether unsettling to them as many modern students seem to think. In fact, we'll point that out in just a minute. But the beast, I think, is without a doubt Rome. And because it's coming from the sea generally indicates Gentiles, the land being Israel. So the sea would indicate that it's Gentiles, so that's Rome. Jim McGuigan concurred in his commentary. He said, who is the fourth beast in Daniel? Everyone agrees it is Rome. We are encouraged in this view by the fact that the beast of Revelation 13 is a composite creature made up of the elements which compose Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. In Daniel, the order is lion, bear, and leopard, but then he's looking into the future. In Revelation 13, verse 2, it's leopard, bear, and lion, for John is looking backward. But what has this to do with identifying the beast of chapter 13? Daniel 7:12 makes the cryptical remark, and as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. The rest of the beasts means the previous 3 beasts. They lost their dominion, but they didn't lose their lives. Their lives are prolonged for a while. How's that? In the 4th kingdom, of course. The 4th beast embodied all their wickedness, and so is described as being made up of them. And I think that's a very astute comment that Jim made in his commentary and tying this description in chapter 13 back to Daniel 7 and verse 12. As to the Jews worshiping Satan or worshiping Rome, while they might not have had literal images that they bowed down to, in reality, they did worship them. Gene wrote, their worship of Satan was through their homage to the empire. If one thinks the leadership of the Jewish people did not pay homage to the emperors of Rome, he should take a look at some things in the Bible itself. John 19, verses 12 to 16. If the language of verses 12 and 16 in this passage does not demonstrate the Jewish leadership paid homage to the beast, to the Roman Empire, we are simply incapable of understanding language. Israel sided with Caesar and even went beyond. She actually coerced a Roman governor into doing what he did not want to do and had no good reason for doing. So who are the saints that the beast fought and conquered? Again, quoting from Gene's commentary. Who then are the saints to whom reference is made? The word is used in an accommodative way, and in the same sense it was used in Daniel to refer to the people of God under the law. Some strongly object, postulating the word saints can denote only Christians. We disagree. Because the beast fought against these saints, he made war on them, but he never conquered them. The beast never conquered the saints of Christ, not even temporarily. But he did utterly conquer the Jews who had once been the saints of God. So I think the saints there is representing the Jews, the same as it did back in the book of Daniel. But the scene moves on in Revelation, chapter 13, and we have the beast from the land. John next saw a second beast, and this time it's coming up out of the land. This seems to be indicating that it is not of divine origin. It is definitely of human origin. And this beast is a little bit different. It has 2 horns like a lamb. It spoke as a dragon, which indicates it really is a follower of the dragon. The beast exercised all the authority of the first beast in his presence. The second beast made the earth, and all who live in it worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. The beast performed great signs, so that he even made fire come down from heaven to earth in the sight of men. But he is a deceiver. You see, the signs aren't real. They're there to deceive the people. And the deception is to get the people to build an image to the first beast. He was granted power to give breath to this image so that it could even speak. Those who would not worship the image of the beast would be killed. Everyone had to have a mark on their right hand or on their forehead, whether great or small, rich or poor, free or slave. And if they did not have this mark, they would not be able to buy or sell anything. This mark is the name or number of the beast. And then John then identified for his readers who this beast was. This beast is a man with a number 666. Most refer to this, by the way, as the Antichrist. Notice nowhere in the text does it say that. In fact, the only usage of the term Antichrist is in 1st and 2nd John. You can't find the word in the book of Revelation. In 1st and 2nd John, it's not the word Antichrist, it's in a plural form, Antichrists, and it refers to false teachers, those who are against Christ. This 666 is not the Antichrist, not identified in the text as that. It is the second beast, and we'll comment on that. In fact, let's start right there. Who is this beast? You need to realize that not all languages have numbers. Numbers in many languages are actually made up of alphabet letters. Now, we should be familiar with Roman numerals, where you use various letters of the alphabet to stand for numbers. An I is a 1, a V is 5, X is 10, L is 50, C is 100, M is 1,000, and it may go up from there. And when you put those together in a combination, you can have numbers. Hebrew was the same, Greek was the same. No numbers, but they'd use letters for the numbers. Now, we have evidence in the 1st century that people not only had their name, but they also had a number. Deisman, in his work called Light from the Ancient Near East, recorded this. A chap named Sagliano has published graffiti, wall scribblings from Pompeii. And these are not later in date than 79 AD. One example of which is as follows. Amerinus thought upon his lady Harmonia for good. The number of her honorable name is 45, or 1035. Another example reads, I love her whose name is 545. So romantic, isn't it? So that tells us, gives us examples that this is the way numbers were used in the 1st century. This is not later than 79 because Pompeii was destroyed in 79. So this is from the 1st century. So throughout history, interpreters have tried to make this beast fit various historical persons, the 666 be somebody from history. Depending on the view you take of Revelation, we talked about those in our first lesson, might indicate where you want to go with this. In the Reformation, both Luther and Calvin identified various popes as the beast as 666. I don't think that's what it's talking about here. Others have identified more recently such people in history as Napoleon Bonaparte or Adolf Hitler. And more recently, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Henry Kissinger, and even Ronald Reagan have been suggested. And I'm sure Saddam Hussein's been made to fit into it as well at some point. But that's all the wrong context, isn't it? We need to keep this in its first century context. The first century context is this. In Hebrew, Caesar Nero would be Neron Kaiser, and it adds up to 666. This is a page from W.B. West's commentary, Revelation through First Century Glasses, and he points out in it, using the Hebrew letters, that Nero, 50 plus 6 plus 200 plus 50, which gives you 306. Caesar, 200 plus 60 plus 100, which gives you 360. And add those two together, and you get 666. Bruce Metzger, in his book Breaking the Code, points this out as well, that the full spelling of Nero Caesar in the Hebrew letters have these numerical values. W.B. West, in his commentary, said this: "There's no question in my mind, there is no 10th of a 1,000th of reservation, but that the mark of the beast was Nero Caesar, and that Nero Caesar was the meanest man that ever lived. Christians looked at him that way. The same people of the Roman world so considered him. So down the ages of biblical history, he has, by the good readers and interpreters, been interpreted as the mark of the beast, for he was very, very beastly." He was the beast. And who was it that did the work of the beast in Judea? Gene West points out, the Jewish leaders, both political and priestly, with the approval of and the aid of the land beast, persecuted the Christians preceding the fall of Jerusalem. These Jewish leaders exercised the authority they had derived from the beast in so doing. The Jewish leaders were more than happy to use the approval and the aid of Rome to persecute the Christians. How does all this fit historically? One thing we know is that there were shrines throughout the Roman world which had been set up for the worship of the empire and the worship of the emperor. In fact, I read that Nero even had the heads taken off of the statues of Apollos and his own placed on them. And some object, though, that the Jews never did worship the emperors. But they did allow temples to the worship of the emperors and the worship of Rome to be built in Israel. This artist's depiction here is in what was in the first century referred to as Caesarea Philippi. Banaeus, it's called today. You can visit there today. But in the first century, the temple on the left was already built. That is a temple for the worship of Augustus. And it was there when Jesus was alive. This is what's left of the foundation or the wall of that particular temple, what you'll see today if you visit Banaeus. And if you were to travel over to Caesarea Maritima, over on the coast, there was a site, it's on the right-hand side of our photograph here, which was dedicated, there's a temple there dedicated to Caesar Augustus and the goddess Roma. Who was the goddess Roma? It was Rome personified as a goddess. The first thing you would see sailing into that man-made harbor in Caesarea Maritima was this temple, which is right there, dedicated to both Augustus and to Rome. That's where Rome was worshipped, in Israel, no less. So they did permit all of that. In fact, not only that, they united with Rome against the Messiah, didn't they? They wanted Jesus killed. They said, we have no king but Caesar. They united with Romans against Christians. So I think this points out that this is definitely what's going on in the land of Judea. You may wonder, what about this fire coming down from heaven? A couple things you need to notice about this. It is a great sign, but it's not a true sign. It's the same thing that Paul wrote in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 9 and 10 concerning the lawless one. And Jesus said that false signs would come about in the years leading up to Jerusalem's destruction. He said in verse 24 of Matthew 24, "At that time, if anyone says to you, 'Look, here's the Christ,' or 'Here,' do not believe him, for false Christs and false prophets will rise up, showing great signs and wonders in order to deceive, if possible, even the chosen ones." So definitely this is, I think without a doubt, referring to what's going on in those years leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. Gene West commented that Carrington insists that the breathing image represents those who hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, the doctrine of Balaam and Jezebel. During the lifetime of the depraved Nero Caesar, Christians all over the empire died for refusing to engage in emperor worship, and the Jews rejoiced in their deaths regardless of the reason. All of this fits historically with what John said was going to happen. In fact, from what we can tell, one of the tests that Christians were submitted to was to bring out a bust of Caesar, a statue of Caesar's head, and ask them to proclaim, "Caesar is Lord." And the Christians wouldn't do it. We read that those who made the yearly proclamation would be given a certificate so they could buy and sell. But Christians wouldn't do it. And the reason was this. They had received a mark. They'd received a seal from God. They didn't need this mark from Caesar. But what this made in conditions for the Christians was, despite Rome being a prosperous land, Christians were very often subjected to poverty and famine-like circumstances. And this leads to yet another scene change in chapter 14. Before we get there, Gene West commented, "Will the church survive an all-out attack from such formidable enemies?" There can be little doubt the Christians of the first century wanted the same thing. Consequently, John addressed the fears of the saints by assuring them God had not forgotten them. This section of the book of Revelation was designed by the Lord to give comfort and provide reasons for confidence in the coming victory of the saints in spite of all oppositions. So the sheen's going to be shifting now to what's going on with the Christians. So the next thing John sees, which opens up chapter 14 for us, is the Lamb on Mount Zion with the 144,000. Now Mount Zion represented victory for God's people. That's where the temple was. That's victory for God's people. The Lamb, of course, we've seen earlier, is Jesus. And we also have seen earlier that the 144,000 represented God's people, all of God's people, 12 times 12 times 10 raised to the third power. These were the ones who had the name of the Father written on their foreheads. They have the seal of God. They refused the seal of the second beast. He next heard a voice from heaven which sounded like many waters and like loud thunder. And if you recall, he heard that back in chapter 1, verses 10 through 15. And there we know it's identified as Jesus. So I think he's seeing Jesus here again. The voice is also described as being like the sound of harpists playing on their harps. A new song was being sung by the 144,000 before the throne, before the four living creatures, and the elders. A song which only they could learn. And again, that's a reference back to Isaiah 42, verses 9 through 10, which talks about the new song that God's people would sing. Then we have a further description of the 144,000. They're described as chaste, undefiled with women. Some translations have that they're virgins. We should keep in mind, again, let me remind you, this is not literal. If this was literal, then 144,000 would all be Jewish male virgins. But that's not what it's talking about there. That they are chaste would indicate their purity. God's people are pure. They've been cleansed by the blood of the Lamb, and they follow the Lamb wherever he goes. And again, we have the picture of the Lamb being the shepherd. It's a picture that I like. The 144,000 are further identified for us as those who have been purchased as first fruits to God. Now, if you think about those who are first fruits, those who became Christians first, that's referring to the Jews who first became Christians. So this part are Jewish Christians. This term first fruits is an agricultural term. It speaks of the first of the crop to be brought in, which was the finest part of the harvest. It was the part that was given to God. And it also speaks, when they had the Feast of the First Fruits, the Feast of Pentecost, it also spoke about there's more to come. There's a coming harvest. This is just the first fruits. There's more to come. The Jewish Christians were the first. There is more to come. Both more Jews to become Christians and Gentiles. God's people are also identified here as having no falsehood and being blameless. So they're honest. They've been cleansed. They've been purified by the blood of the Lamb, so they can stand without fault before God's throne. But then we have again another scene change. John next saw angels flying in the midst of heaven. The first angel has an eternal, everlasting gospel. The Greek word is euangelion. It's good news. It's an everlasting good news to proclaim to all who live in the land. Gene West suggested that it was to be announced to those who dwelt in the land, meaning to the Jews, and to every other creature under heaven, those of the empire. This gospel was not the message of salvation brought by Christ, but a message of salvation from persecution and martyrdom. And this seems to be what this is talking about here. Notice that the good news, it's a good news that's everlasting. The beast isn't everlasting. It's defeatable. And the beast will not defeat the good news of Jesus. The first angel's message is this: reverence God and give glory to him. The hour of his judgment has come. Worship the one who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and the fountains of water. What we have here is a call for all to worship and serve God as the creator of all, because the time of his judgment had arrived. Just after the first angel, there is a second angel with a second message. This message is, she has fallen. She has fallen, Babylon the Great. She has made all the nations to drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Now, this is a direct quote, by the way, from the prophets. Isaiah 21, verse 9, Jeremiah 51, Jeremiah 25, all have that either identically or very similar. Now, this is the first time we've come across this particular description of Babylon. So we've yet to make a positive identification of Babylon. So the question for us should be, who is Babylon? I would suggest that there are only three possibilities: Babylon itself, or Jerusalem, or Rome. Babylon had been destroyed 400 years earlier. So I think we can be confident it is not the literal Babylon. This is a book of symbols and figures, so Babylon standing for something. Now, many commentaries opt for Rome, that Babylon's Rome. And they've got to do so because they take a late date for the book. And by that point, Jerusalem, if it had been written in the 90s, Jerusalem would have been already destroyed. I don't believe that's right either. I would suggest at this stage that this is speaking of the same city that was referred to back in chapter 11, verse 8. The great city that symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. Donald Taylor, in his commentary, pointed this out. Babylon is the great harlot in chapter 17. We'll get to that in future weeks. Babylon's the great harlot who is identified as the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. The only great city which has been mentioned in the Apocalypse is the one which is trampled by the nations for 42 months and identified as being the city where also our Lord was crucified. Basing interpretation upon this internal evidence, the conclusion that Babylon the Great is Jerusalem seems natural and correct. And I think Donald is absolutely correct as well. Within the next few chapters, we're going to get a lot more information about Babylon, and we're going to be able to substantiate that suggestion. But just for now, just think about this. As Jerusalem is the city that fell, Rome never fell in this way. To me, this makes the best sense. Gene West pointed out that just as the literal city of Babylon attacked Jerusalem and destroyed her magnificent temple, so apostate Israel, acting as another Babylon, attacked and attempted to destroy the temple of our Lord Jesus Christ. I think that's a good comparison as to why that term is used here to speak of Jerusalem. So the message of the second angel is that Jerusalem has fallen. And then there's a third angel. The third angel has yet a third message. If anyone worships the beast and his image and receives a mark on his forehead or his hand, he will drink the wine of God's wrath. And it continues on. This seems to be more of a warning to God's people. Don't be involved in the worship of the beast. The description of the wine of God's wrath tells us that this is God's full anger. It's very strong. It's undiluted. It's being directed towards the Jews and the destruction of the city. By the way, the language here is based on Jeremiah 25 and verse 15. Gene West wrote, unless one were an emperor worshiper, or in some way a worshiper of the gods of the Romans, his ability to conduct business was greatly hampered or rendered impossible. This would have motivated some to return to the ways of the Jews, who had a legally recognized religion in the Roman Empire. You see, the Jews didn't have to make that declaration because their religion was recognized. And by the way, what happened during the 60s in the Hebrew writer aspect? That's the reason Hebrews was written, isn't it? That the Christians, the Jewish Christians, were wanting to revert to just being Jews. Things were not going well for them. See, the pressure was immense for Christians to give in, to make this statement that Caesar is Lord so they could carry on their lives and livelihoods. But the problem for a Christian was that this would mean denying Jesus. And this is why we see the severity of God's reaction to his people making such a statement. And text tells us that the person who does this will be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. Those who worship the beast would have no rest forever and ever, day or night. Their punishment would be eternal. W.B. West wrote that in chapter 13, unless you had the mark of the beast, unless you worshiped the beast, you could not buy or sell. Unless you worship the beast, you are subject to persecution, imprisonment, and often death. Now the tables are turned, and those who have worshipped the beast, who have his image, who have received the mark on their foreheads and their hands, shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, and shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. We see how completely reversed is the situation as mirrored here in the great book of Revelation. We find here in all of this, in these two chapters, two groups of people. The first group are those who worshipped the beast of the image, and we suggested that's the apostate Jewish nation. I believe that it is. Here in chapter 14, it's talking about those who received the mark of the beast's name. And those were Christians who compromised, Christians who thought that they could do this and then repent of it later. But John then heard a voice saying, telling him to write, "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on." Now, death referred to here basically is martyrdom, physical death, being killed simply because they were Christians. And basically what John is saying is there's bad news and there's good news in this, very much like we often do. Do you want the bad news first or the good news? The bad news is there's going to be further martyrdom for the Christians. More Christians are going to die. The good news, though, is those who die faithful to the Lord are blessed. You see, death was not to be looked on as a curse, but as a blessing if the person was faithful to the Lord. The blessing is that they would have rest, eternal rest from their labors, because their works follow them. There's a huge difference between the reward of the faithful Christian and what those who follow the beast receive. A vast difference. John then says that we have sort of a scene change again. And he said he saw a white cloud. And sitting on the cloud was one like the Son of Man. Now, in Scripture, particularly in the prophets, it's deity who ride on clouds. Isaiah uses that. Even David uses that in Psalm 104. The scene we have here, by the way, is very similar to what we find in Daniel's vision in Daniel chapter 7. White indicates purity, majesty, victory. We've seen that before. So I believe what we have here is Jesus in view. The Son of Man is described as having a golden crown on his head. This time it's a Stephanos. It's the victor's wreath. And he has a sharp sickle in his hand. So the image we have is that a harvest is about to take place. I would suggest to you that this is not the final judgment. This is God's judgment at a particular time. And I would suggest that this is very parallel to what Jesus said again in Matthew 24. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will wail, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and much glory. He will send his angels with the sound of a great trumpet, and they will gather his chosen ones from the four winds, from one corner of heaven to another. So again, we have Jesus talking about just before the destruction of Jerusalem, Son of Man coming on clouds and gathering his chosen ones, the harvest taking place. Another angel then came out of the temple and called with a loud voice, "Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is fully ripe." These angels coming out of the temple tells us that they are sent from God. And the time for reaping had arrived. The harvest was ready. In Greek, it literally says the harvest of the land is dry. That indicates that this is the wheat harvest. And the harvest of wheat always speaks of the gathering in of God's people, as opposed to the chaff, which would not be God's people. And this wording as well carries the idea of complete readiness. It's time for God's people to come out. So it says the Son of Man swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. Gene West tells us that the righteous were to be harvested out of the land of Israel. They were to flee into the wilderness because the hour had come for the Lord to take the righteous under his protection, gather them into his barns, so to speak, because the harvest of the land, harvest of Israel, had withered. Christ, the reaper, brought protection and preservation to the saints living in Israel at the time of the invasion by the Romans. And I think this is just parallel to what we've seen earlier in the previous chapters in Revelation, that the Christians are not going to be caught up in what's going to happen to Jerusalem. Another angel came out of the temple, which is in heaven. This angel also had a sharp sickle. And yet another angel came out, this time from the altar. This one had power over the fire. And the latter called to the one with the sickle, "Put in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe." and the angel did. So what we have going on here, we've just seen the first reaping, that was of grain, Jesus gathering in his own. This reaping is of grapes, the gathering of those who are left, and they are to be thrown into the great winepress of the wrath of God. That alone should tell us that this is not good. We don't want to be thrown into anything to do with the wrath of God. Gene West pointed out that we have a different kind of reaping here. The reaping of the grain was one of preservation, while this one, as we shall see, is one of destruction. Recalling our study of the word guess or land in this work, we know the vineyard to be harvested was the land of Israel. It was the people of a particular land who were to be harvested for the winepress, not the people of the whole earth. So the indication there where the whole earth is talking about all that were in the land of Israel. By the way, this idea of a vine, it's a representation of the nation of Judah, and it has been since the prophets. Jeremiah wrote about it. Ezekiel wrote about it. In fact, also in Ezekiel 15, nation of Judah is portrayed as a vine. It's an image that's known from Scripture. The winepress was trampled. By the way, that's exactly what you do to get the juice out of the grapes, isn't it? You trample it with bare feet. And it's done outside the city. This seems to be a direct reference to what was already spoken of concerning the trampling of the holy city back in chapter 11, verse 2. But this is also from the prophets in Isaiah 63, verse 3. But blood came out from the winepress as deep as a horse's bridle for a distance of 1,600 stadia. Now, 1,600 stadia is a Greek or a Roman measurement. It's about 200 miles. We'll comment on that in just a minute. But this wine was not collected as you would normally collect the grape juice when you're trampling out the grapes. Instead, it's allowed to run out in the ground until it formed a lake of blood. Gene West cited Josephus' Jewish Wars, and pointing out that if this figure does nothing else, it impresses us with the magnitude of the carnage during the Roman invasion. Josephus pictured the slaughter grotesquely when he said the Roman soldiers slew all they met in Jerusalem and made the city run with blood, so much so that the fires in many of the houses were quenched by the blood of those fallen. And that's Josephus commenting, but again, isn't it amazing how similar that is to what John's recording here? This number 1,600, I think its importance is not so much its distance, but in the number itself. 1,600 is made up of 4 times 4 times 10 squared. Again, we've got numerology going on here, I think. 4 is the number of the earth, and 10, of course, raised to a power, indicates completeness. So this is indicating the complete harvest of the land, complete punishment of the land. But it's also interesting, the idea of 40 showing up, because you could also get 1,600 as 40 times 40. 40 is the number of days of rain in the days of Noah, as well as the number of years Israel was in the wilderness because they refused to obey God. So 40 shows up in Israel's history as a time of punishment. It is also interesting that if we convert this to miles, or just look at it as mileage, as distance, that 1,600 stadia, roughly 200 miles, is the length of Israel from north to south. So maybe it's got something to do with that as well. But I think in all of this, what we're supposed to see is God's judgment was coming, but his people would be spared while the enemies of God's people would receive justice. Now keep in mind that as far as the events that are being portrayed in chapter 14, this chapter is out of chronological sequence because we've not yet had Jerusalem falling. In literature, by the way, this is called a prolepsis. And the idea is It lets you know the end of the story before you get there. And in particular, this is letting the Christians know the end of the story so that they don't get discouraged. They're going to win. Jim McGuigan wrote concerning, sort of summarizing chapter 14. He said, the chapter comes as an encouraging response to chapter 13. In it, we have the picture of triumphant saints, martyrs, and non-martyrs. They already sing a new song concerning the new deliverance. The saints are pictured as loyal, pure, obedient, and courageous followers of the Lamb. 6 proclamations are made which stir the hearts of the godly. The enemy's going to pay, and you're blessed even if you die. The wheat is gathered, and the grapes are trampled in the winepress of God's wrath. And that leads us to where we'll be in our next lesson, which is chapters 15 and 16. We're going to have a look at the 7 bowls of God's wrath, and those bowls being poured out. So if you get a chance before you watch our next episode, reread chapters 13 and 14, and reread 13 and 14. If you get a chance, read chapters 15 and 16. I'd like to thank you for joining us for this particular lesson, and hope it was at least informative as to what the view that we're taking for Revelation means. I hope you'll come back and tune in for the next episode as we look at our 9th lesson, which will be chapters 15 and 16.